All right, we'll wait just a moment for the stream to pop up fully. Okay, I see the stream is live on Hoova. Good morning and almost afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to one of our other sessions today. Now, the topic of today is all about addressing lead poisoning in resource-limited areas in Washington. If you are just joining today, this is our sixth annual Overdose series. Super, super, super exciting to have been doing this for 6 full years. Just excellent. So I'm very excited to introduce a couple of our speakers today. So first we have Representative Jerry Pollet. Representative Pollet, thank you very much for joining us today. Represents the 46th district, so that's North and Northeast Seattle in the Washington legislature. He has taught the second-year policy block in the community-oriented public health practice program at the University of Washington. I'm personally very partial to this program, having graduated from it myself, so it's always a pleasure to run into Representative Pollet again out in the real world. So his legislative work reflects his interest in public health policy in collaboration with his students, including passing the first state legislation in the U.S. regulating e-cigarette and vaping products, first in the U.S. legislation to address sexual misconduct, passing the harasser practices at Washington colleges and universities, and Washington's environmental justice laws, as well as eliminating lead in school water. He has also been recognized as the leading advocate in the legislature for special education and for his work on behalf of access for post-secondary education. Jerry has been appointed by the governor to be one of Washington's 3 commissioners on the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education. Additionally, he has supervised several Masters of Public Health capstone students whose literature reviews and other work provided the basis for many of Washington's strongest in the nation legislation to test for and limit lead in school drinking water. We also have Dr. Scott Phillips joining us today. Dr. Phillips has so many acronyms after his name. I'm not going to list them all here. He's board certified in internal medicine and toxicology for over 30 years. He is the chief executive officer of the Washington Poison Center. In addition to his position at Washington Poison Center, Dr. Phillips continues his work as a hospitalist at Providence Mount Carmel Hospital in Colville, Washington, as a fellow of the American College of Physicians, the American Academy of Clinical Toxicology, and the American College of Medical Toxicology. Dr. Phillips is dedicated to ongoing education and teaching. Focusing on environmental toxicology and health risk assessment, Dr. Phillips has authored over 200 articles, chapters, and abstracts, as well as several textbooks on medical toxicology. So, folks, needless to say, there's a lot of expertise in this virtual space here. Now, very, very quick little housekeeping note, then I will hush up and silence myself. If you have questions and comments, please post those in the chat box. I will do my best to moderate those, and I will field questions toward both of our speakers when they are ready for those. And as a reminder, if you want a certificate of completion for attending the series, you'll need to fill out our end of series evaluation we'll send at the end of August. All right, without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Representative Pollet. It's all yours.
Well, thank you so much. It is just an incredible honor to be appearing here in the Overdose Awareness Series, and especially with Dr. Phillips, whose work I look to in terms of my teaching and much of my other work in terms of risk assessment and cleanup at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, and considerations of things like lead that we're going to hear about in terms of Lake Roosevelt and Superfund sites. So it's just a deep honor to be here. And today's presentation is an update and relies on slides that were developed by 3 of my former community-oriented public health practice MPH students at the University of Washington School of Public Health, Molly Cotting, Claire Woolsey, and Kira Saturn-McCoy. Today, when we think about lead in school water, There's a lot of people think lead, water, not a problem in Washington state. And as we'll be discussing, we're finding that it is indeed a very serious public health problem, especially for children in schools. We'll also be talking about cookware and family exposures, and that there is a very serious misunderstanding, including in public health officials and public policy officials who believe that we just don't have a problem, or that the sources of lead exposure are not in the soil, not in the water, but just limited to what they read many years ago about paint and the reduction of lead in the air from removal of leaded gasoline. So with that, we'll move into the presentation and a little bit about why lead is in the news right now. June 4th, 2025, elevated water levels found in multiple Edmonds School District schools based on the state law that I'll be talking about today that was passed in 2021. Took 5 years of effort to pass this law to require testing for lead in all schools across Washington. Every fountain and faucet that is used for potable water has to be tested within 5 years. And we're going to show that we're finding very disturbing levels of lead still in our children's school water. So Edmonds had several schools that, as of in 2024, tested significantly above our state standard. And our state standard, and we'll talk about this if you read the lower part of the slide here, the news article says the reading of 323 parts per billion is 20 times the level at which the EPA requires corrective action. One of the other misstatements that is very common up in this field is people thinking that the EPA has a drinking water standard for lead. And we'll talk about that. They do not. Here's an update from the UW School of Public Health about how student capstones were responsible for the passage of this legislation and continue to serve as the monitors of implementation of the law. And another news article about this: 1/5 of the water outlets were above our state standard of 5 parts per billion in Edmonds. Spokane headlines again: 63% of schools tested during the 23-24 school year had at least one water fixture exceeding the 5 parts per billion limit. This is a widespread problem, and this article from Spokane also highlights some of the misinformation out there. School official responding to the reporter said, "At first it was surprising until I did some research and learned there's lead in all the drinking water. It's not just isolated to the schools." False, false, false. Every water utility publishes their annual water quality contaminant report. It's available online. We can all go and look at the lead in Spokane's water. There is no lead in Spokane's aquifer water. The irony and the illogic of this is, if the water coming into the school had lead in it, the same level of lead would appear in all the outlets. It doesn't. So what's the cause? The cause is no longer lead service lines. All of them were removed in Spokane. The cause is the actual fixtures which were installed over 20 years ago and all have lead fittings and copper fittings in them, and we need to replace those. And um, so the law says we test every school that didn't replace their faucets and fixtures since 2016. So here's our agenda today. We're talking about why lead is a widespread problem and the health effects. Washington State is not doing the job we need to do to screen our children for lead. And now we also are discovering that we have a serious problem of lead in popularly available cookware, pots, pans, pressure cookers, and what we can do to take action to expand testing. So when we send our children to school, the last thing we expect is for them to return with their IQ reduced. And that's what lead does. There is no safe level of lead, period. Lead exposure impacts cognition, behavioral, emotional health, and development. It's neurotoxic. Until 2021, Washington State, like many states, did not have a required testing program for school buildings. And we didn't have a health-based standard for action. The federal lead and copper rule issued by EPA is not a Safe Drinking Water Act maximum contaminant level. It is not an enforceable standard, and it is set at a level at which, as we may be able to get into, if a child is drinking, it will have a serious impact at 15 parts per billion on cognitive development, IQ, and behavior. What that lead and copper rule says is a water utility needs to test a certain number of water outlets across the entire city or air service area. And if a certain percentage, about 10%, exceed 15 parts per billion, you're not required to do anything at that home. Instead, you have to begin corrosion changes in your water supply. And I'll remind you that the corrosion issues were what led to the Flint water crisis, when the city of Flint was switched to the Flint River in their water. Before 2021, we had several years in which we funded the Department of Health to have elementary schools tested voluntarily. And at that point in time, we found 82% of the schools that were being voluntarily tested had at least one outlet with lead levels above 5 parts per billion. And this is a slide that we presented to the legislature, and this chart was from the Department of Health, reprinted in the Seattle Times, and showed that some of the schools had astronomical levels of lead in some of their outlets. And here's another analysis done by Molly Cotting, capstone student. 451 schools were above 5 parts per billion, 271 above 15. And you see Nia Bay, 1,780 parts per billion, Natchez Elementary, 1,000. And I'm going to show you a slide that shows we're continuing to find levels of above 1,000 parts per billion lead in our school water with the most recent testing. And it just shows how many of the schools would have required replacing the fixtures that tested above 5 parts per billion. Because that's what we decided we needed to do, is not rip out the piping. It's changing the fixtures unless all the water in all the faucets in a wing of a school or the entire school are elevated. Otherwise, we know it's the fixtures. HB 1139 passed in 2021. It took 5 years to pass. Our school districts largely fought tooth and nail against passage of this legislation. They said it would be an unfunded mandate and cut into school funding. There were a number of PTSAs that organized to go to their school boards and say, what are you doing opposing legislation that is aimed at protecting our children from lead in the school water? And we're on track to have every public school tested by 2026 and then once every 5 years. If a fixture is above 5 parts per billion, it has to be removed from service. Excuse me, if it's above 15 parts per billion, immediately removed from service. If it's above 5, the school district can close it and fix it over the summer. And there's funding. It's not very expensive to replace the outlets, faucets. So there is ample funding through this Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction from the legislature. In 2023-24 school year, this is a chart showing 1,511 school water outlets were above the action level. So we still have a serious problem. 1,500 out of about 12,000. 3,681 of those school water outlets were above the 1 part per billion recommendation for lead in drinking water for children from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Who's exposed? Well, this is an issue that is not surprising that there are great disparities in terms of the exposure, because who is least likely to have new faucets and fixtures in addition to having lead service lines? And this is tied entirely to income, and we know poverty and race are two sides of the same coin in America. And as we'll be talking about, and Dr. Phillips will talk about, you've got cumulative exposures. It's not just our water, it may be your soil. And it may be the cookware, showing the need for screening. Lead service lines, Biden administration's Infrastructure Act had funding to remove all lead lines within a decade. Flint, Michigan just accomplished that. They announced last week. But that funding is, like many other things, no longer necessarily going to be available under the new administration. This is an illustration of how removing lead from gasoline had a dramatic improvement in public health. And you see the levels of lead in blood, how significant the drop has been. Many people think that lead is no longer a problem if you're not exposed to it in the air from lead gasoline and a child isn't eating lead-based paint. So what are our low level of lead exposure? Very low levels can have significant impacts. In fact, the modeling shows that adding 5 parts per billion at a low level has a disproportionate impact on IQ. And so we see a 5 part per billion, 5 micrograms per deciliter, blood lead level difference has significant impacts on IQ, perceptual reasoning, and working memory. That is very significant for relatively low change in low levels of blood, and why we no longer say that 15 micrograms per deciliter or 10 micrograms per deciliter are the cutoff for what is considered elevated blood lead levels. Children are more vulnerable. Won't go through this. Here's some of the conclusions for the health effects of low-level exposure, neurobehavior in children, developmental neurocognitive abilities, and an IQ of 1 to 5, decline of 1 to 5 points associated with an increase in blood lead levels of 10 micrograms per deciliter. And there's no threshold that's been identified for the effects of lead on IQ. In Flint, Michigan, famously, the water was tested as between 200 and 13,200 parts per billion. We know how shocking this has been. Many schools in Washington, though, have had fountains and sinks tested in this same range of up to 4,000 parts per billion and over 200 parts per billion. 2 last year tested at over 4,000 parts per billion. To me, this is truly horrifying. And there are numerous exposures that we need to be thinking about. As a reminder, we have to take this action at the state level. The federal rules do not include an enforceable MCL for drinking water for lead. The federal rule only requires 5 outlets to be tested in each school, not every outlet. So likely to miss outlets. Doesn't require retesting. It doesn't provide support for remediation. That's why we needed a state law. And in 2024, EPA adopted a new update to identify and replace lead lines within 10 years. This is now in jeopardy. And the threshold for water utilities take action was reduced by 1/3 to 10 parts per billion. But remember, this is a water utility chooses which homes it's going, or outlets in commercial buildings, it's going to test. And we have evidence that many water utilities deliberately don't test homes in the areas where you are most likely to have elevated lead. Even if the results come back with over 10%, over 10 parts per billion, nothing happens other than they should adjust their corrosion controls. So we've talked about the HB 1139. Washington State is failing miserably to screen our children. And 2019 data, nearly 70% of primary care providers said we should be screening children below 6. The number who actually did so was 39%. The state auditor did a performance audit of our Medicaid lead testing for children, and the results are horrifying, I think. And there's a beautiful statement from the state auditor. Here in the beautiful Evergreen State, we may think lead exposure is only an issue on the East Coast or the Midwest with a history of industrial pollution in older homes. We can never be complacent about the risks our children face. Compared with 6 other Western states, Washington has the highest percentage of children with elevated blood lead levels, yet tested children for lead exposure at the second to lowest rate in the group. Only 26% of the children received at least one of the two federally required screenings between 1 and 6. And here's the data. What's more shocking is how many children received both of those tests? Only 3%. I'm out of time here, so I'm just going to say the response of the agencies is truly inadequate. And I'm going to skip our discussion of the serious problem with lead in cookware due to time, and just say we need to, these are the recommendations from the state auditor. We need to have funding and an assurance that every child enrolled in Medicaid has blood lead level testing. And we need to do a lot more education amongst both providers and public officials across the state about the need to be testing and the fact that we do have a lead problem here in Washington State. So with that, I will stop here and turn it over to Dr. Phillips and stop my screen share and look forward to answering questions.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Representative Pollet. I'm keeping an eye on the chat box. No questions yet, but folks, if you have questions, plop them in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll field them toward the end. All right, let's make sure, Dr. Phillips, you can share your screen, okay?
Okay. And we hope that's working. We can get into presenter mode.
It's doing the same thing with subtitles that we saw in our practice session. There we go. But we know how to fix it now. Perfect.
We learned it. How about that?
We did. Yeah. All right. Take it away, Dr. Phillips.
Great. Thank you very much. And this is such a huge topic. I mean, we could spend a week-long seminar talking about lead in our state, in our country, and around the world. I've been involved in a lot of massive lead contamination sites throughout the world, in most continents. And lo and behold, it's an issue here, as Rep. Pollet has discussed for us. So I thought it would be valuable to look at a specific site. There's many lead contaminated sites in Washington State. This is one that I think is particularly interesting and actually is still in the midst of ongoing cleanup. So this is the Leoy smelter, and this is in a very small town in Northeast Washington. The whole town is about 300 acres. There's only about 300 people in the whole city. It's about 100 miles north of Spokane, about 40 miles north of Colville, just south of the Canadian border. And that's the Columbia River you can see coming through town. If you look on the right side on the edge of town, you'll see kind of a flattened area there with soil. That's the former mine site. Now, it's interesting that this is an area that is rich in mines. And this is a map showing different mines in Washington State. We do have a long history of mining in the state, and not just lead, but many other elements as well. This particular mine site also mined copper, which commonly goes with lead, and that's why there's the lead copper rule that Rep. Pollet talked about. Now, I want to focus a little bit in the very northeast corner of Washington State, and right in the center of the area, you see this is where we're talking about right here. This is Trail, British Columbia, which is just across the border, and there's actually a lead smelter there with some history. So there's a double dose here. We have one in Trail on the river, and you have one in Northport on the river that's led to some significant contamination over the years. Well, so we have this cross-border contamination, certainly in the Columbia River, and it's impacted miles and miles downstream. The Trail BC smelter really started about 130 years ago, and it's evolved since that time. At one point, it was producing over 10 tons of sulfur dioxide, and this literally resulted in killing vegetation on all the mountainsides. I grew up in this part of Washington State, And as a child, I remember crossing over the border, which we frequently did, and the mountains were just devoid of vegetation. It was quite a sad thing with a pretty strong sulfur odor. Well, there was some fines for this area and for damaging not only the trees, but local farmers' crops. At a huge smelter there, this one smokestack was over 400 feet tall. So there's a whole cleanup on that side. But what about the side on the US border side? Well, the map on the left side of the slide shows some of the mineralogy of Northeast Washington. And this is really the area of geomedicine. Geomedicine is the interface of geology and medicine, obviously has a lot to do with different minerals causing problems in people. And lead is one of the more common ones that we see, as is all the other sort of heavy metals and mineral silicates like asbestos and so forth. If we look right here in the corner of Washington, you see this area, and there's little tiny X's. It's kind of hard to see, but these are lead-rich areas. And there's lead-rich areas all around this area. And so there's many, many mines, as we saw before in those little spots. This is a look looking at the old smelter in Northport. And this is actually a picture looking inside, and they had 6 furnaces lined up in this. So it was actually a very large smelter, a very small town, a very large smelter that produced both copper and lead. And of course, this really reached a fervor after the First World War and the Second World War, where minerals were an important component for the military machinery at the time. And I show this slide because this shows a lot of the environmental impact on the mountainsides around Trail. Trail is a beautiful town. You should all go visit it. Now there's some wonderful vineyards there and great restaurants, and it's certainly worth the trip. This is the smelter across the bridge and across the river in Northport, again, operated around the same time. And they got not only lead and copper, but there was some gold and silver. All those minerals were rich in this area. And it was really one of the largest on the West Coast. And of course, the problem here is both these smelters were located on the Columbia River, as I'd mentioned before. Most of this was demolished in the early 1950s. And then for a period of time, a sawmill operated on this site and was ultimately remediated with the cleanup. Looking at the impact area here, you can see Northport right below the border. You can see the Trail smelter up here coming down the river. And you can see how this really impacted. Well, this went all the way down the river, all the way down to near Colville. And you can see here's a picture of the mine site, the smelter site itself. And here they're pouring some copper out of one of the furnaces. Well, what happened? Yeah, they closed it down. Well, it didn't really result in much interest until the Colville Confederated Tribes petitioned the EPA in 1999. This is recent history about environmental contamination of the upper Columbia River. And this resulted in a large EPA study, resulted in cooperation with the Tech Cominco facility in Trail, BC, the EPA and the environmental group in British Columbia were collaborating on this because both were contaminating the rivers. And the river just had this dark sludge mineral deposits lining the shores of the river that went for miles and miles down. And ultimately they had this remedial investigation. Well, primarily this was an environmental cleanup. It was not health surveillance. So there's no lead levels in children, despite them living in this area. The soil is rich in lead. That's why there was lots of lead mines all over this area. And they really started sampling only 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago, sampling the smelter property that expanded. And they started soil removers, sort of dig and haul type of remediation, which is going on through last year, actually. Last year, they removed 5,400 tons of contaminated soil from some private residential properties that had elevated soil levels above 700 milligrams per kilogram or parts per million in the soil there. So it's still ongoing. This is a picture of the site now right on the edge of town. And so what does all this mean? You know, we talk about soil concentrations and what does that mean for a child? We know that children, the ingestion rate that the EPA uses as a default risk assessment number is 100 milligrams per day. Well, what's 100 milligrams of soil? Well, I took the liberty of doing the calculations for you on the left. So 100 milligrams of soil is about the size of a pinch of table salt, a few grains up to an eighth of a teaspoon. It's not very much of soil to be ingested every day. And it's about half that for adults because adults tend not to have the same sort of hand-to-mouth ingestion issue as children. So it's about the third of a mass of one aspirin tablet. Kind of gives you a visual. So we're talking about small amounts are what was put into the health impact. And these areas are just rich in lead all over. The Bossberg Beach is a popular recreational beach just downstream from Northport. And this area, known as the Bossberg Flat, was closed in 2012 due to really high lead levels there. And also there was another campground that had very dangerous levels, and the swimming hole across the river from Northport and Sheep Creek had high arsenic levels. And ultimately they remediated almost 10,000 tons of sediment from these black sand beaches. Obviously the black sand was oxidized lead and arsenic. This gives you another picture of where this would be. The green area just south of the Canadian border is Northport area, and you can see going down over the Bossberg Flat Evans Campground, and you can see the position of Colville where that's located. Again, this is still about 60 miles north of Spokane. But the impact washed down the river and impacted the Colville Confederated Tribe, which you see in the purple area on the lower left corner of the slide there. And fortunately, that's what really kicked off this remediation program so we can get this put back together. So what they found 32 properties that had levels less than 250 parts per million. The highest one, greater than 251, there was 8 properties. And they did some arsenic sampling as well, and there was 18 properties that were above the action level for them as well. So this is a significant impact downstream from this site. And, you know, why do we care? Rep. Pollet was getting into this area. Why does it matter? Why does 5, ppb matter for water concentrations? Why does soil concentrations matter? And it matters because of the impact on neurodevelopment primarily. You always see this, a slide or something similar to this going, oh, but back in 1970, when I was in high school, the level of concern was 60 micrograms per deciliter. And you can see, well, that's ratcheted down as we've developed more and more lead testing. A lot of those were from Herb Needleman's studies in Baltimore and looking at dental lead levels in kids and IQ testing. And so now this number is going down. So currently the CDC uses a blood reference value of 3.5 microgram per deciliter. So again, there's no known benefit of lead, and that really sort of goes to therefore there's no safe level of lead. But ideally, the lower we get, the better. And this was really one of the kickoffs studies in 2005 with one of the Lamphere papers. This really followed some of the Herb Needleman studies from Baltimore as well, just showing this relationship between childhood intellectual impairment and low lead concentrations. And these get very dicey. Why is a level between 1 and 10 different than a level between 10 and 15 as far as IQ points? There is probably some sampling data and accuracy of IQ testing in there, but suffice it to say, these are all statistically significant, and we can argue about what these small differences in IQ point means, but there's a difference if you have an IQ of 145 versus an IQ of 87. It can have a tremendous impact on kids. often, as you realize, these areas are in socially impacted areas. Poverty levels are high, smoking rates are high, education rates tend to be lower in some of these areas, substance abuse tends to be higher, suicide rates are much higher in these areas. So it's a multiplied process. But of course, we can control lead. We have a hard time controlling some of the things, but we can certainly control lead. So this study that was done by Lamphere looked at 1,300 children and followed them from 5 to 10 years. And that's where they did full-scale IQ points to look at this, determining this determination. You can see here's this log linear scale looking at this with lead levels and IQ. And you can see how the higher the lead concentrations, the lower the IQ points. And you can see the curve is steeper on the low blood level end. And that's where we talked about some differences in there. But the end result is it lowers IQ points and it's not needed. Exposure pathways, it's not just soil, it's not just water and drinking in schools and other residential community work sites. There's lots of occupational settings. There's lots of non-occupational sources for lead that we see commonly at the Poison Center. It's quite a ubiquitous metal that causes problem. Well, how does it enter the body? It's different whether the form is organic or inorganic. Inorganic really goes through the lungs and the GI tract, so it's mostly inhaled from fumes or ingested. And once it's ingested, it goes into the divalent metal transport protein, and that co-transporter also moves iron and calcium. And so lead essentially jumps onto that same transporter, moves it from the chyme, and as you remember from high school biology, the liquidy food stuff that comes out of the stomach goes into the small intestine in the apex of the apical membrane that's moved through the cell and ultimately into the bloodstream. Adults absorb about 20% of lead, kids absorb 70%. So kids are much more efficient at stripping lead out of food sources, and that's also a bigger risk. Particularly if they're low on low on iron and calcium, they'll absorb even more. Then there's, of course, a recycling within different pools within the body. There's a blood pool, a bony and teeth pool of lead, and soft tissue pool, and it can all interchange, and it depends on the particular metabolic conditions going on. We know that people that fracture a bone can have spikes in lead. We know that people with hyperthyroidism can have spikes in lead, which can mobilize it to get into the brain. So these different pools in the body are important, and its elimination is sort of generalized all over, mostly in the kidneys if you have some good kidney function, but you will eliminate some in the stool, some circulation back through the bile, but also remembering that only a fraction is absorbed in adults and about 30% is not absorbed in children. So that's a major elimination pathway. Well, just talking very briefly about the toxicodynamic, the health effects of lead. Lead impairs aminolevulinic acid dehydratase, so it doesn't allow formation of normal red blood cells, and it also blocks ferroketolase, which is the kind of the final step in forming a hemoglobin molecule. And you can see the resulting little red dots here, purple dots. This is called basophilic stippling that you only see in very chronic, severe cases. It's unusual to see it in lead poisoning nowadays. But it affects both behavioral and non-behavioral effects in the kidney, in the brain. In the kidney, it affects the proximal tubules. So the proximal tubules are responsible for reabsorbing sugar and proteins and vitamins. And what happens is with that dysfunction, they just get spilled out into the urine. Anemia is common, of course. Hypertension. Hypertension is not as great of a problem on an individual basis. We're talking about 1 to 2 millimeters of mercury blood pressure difference. That's very difficult to measure if you've ever pumped up a blood pressure cuff. But if you're talking about population studies and epidemiology, it definitely has an impact at that point. And of course, there's some reproductive effects to this. So what does all this mean? It really means prevention. So it means fixing the schools and the residential properties that have lead. It means remediation of contaminated sites. These legacy sites are not just old mine sites, as we've heard from Rep. Pollet's lecture. These exist today in schools and other sites where our schools are educating our kids and they're getting their drinking water at times. So it's important to think about this, and it's important to do lead surveillance. We've tried to do some things with King County. There's been a pretty low response rate from providers to follow up and do lead testing at 1 and 6 years of age. It is true that our adherence to trying to do those recommended screening levels or mandated federal screening levels, we fall far short of that in the state of Washington. We think, as Rep. Pollet said, this is a problem for Baltimore and Philadelphia, but not a problem here, when in fact, that's really not the case. So with that, I want to end and thank you for your time and generous participation with this. And we're more than happy to answer any questions if we have some time. Alex, I'll turn it back to you.
Perfect. Well, first, thank you both. That was great. Just hearing, both of you offer your perspectives on this very, very real and present issue of lead poisoning. And something I just personally noted was how you both brought in this discussion of IQ. And I really appreciated that. And I also appreciated you both, yes, there are so many factors that affect intelligence and how we even define intelligence. And yes, we don't need to throw more barriers to concentration and focus and all of that. So just thank you both for that. Oh, please, Representative Pollet, I saw you about to speak.
Before we go to questions, I wanted to reserve some comment after I saw Dr. Phillips had shared his slides with me. One of the things about the combination of effects that we need to be concerned about is I talked about school water. Dr. Phillips talked about soil. We have a lot of schools and playgrounds and other areas used by children that have lead and lead arsenate, both from smelters and mine operations and from orchards used as pesticides spread across Washington. A lot of these lands were used for schools, and we actually have no special rule or program to now go after testing the soil in the playgrounds and the ingestion rate, the inhalation rate. The inhalation rate for dust is much higher in Eastern Washington, where you do have even more of the schools built on former orchard lands. It's very disconcerting and hidden away in the state budget since 2009 has been a budget proviso that school districts sought that bars the Board of Health and Department of Health from adopting environmental health protection rules for schools. And we need it badly.
Thank you for adding that. And thank you for drawing that connection. I think it's, it can be very easy for anyone to focus on, this is the single source of exposure or the single area of concern. And just exactly to your point, we have to take this very holistic view of that lead can get into the body in so many ways, but it can also be in our environment in so many different ways. So thank you for adding that. The one question I see so far is, and I believe this is more for you, Representative Pollet, but Dr. Phillips, please chime in if you would like, is just broadly, what is the best cookware for cooking if we're keeping lead exposure in mind?
King County Hazardous Waste Program and Seattle-King County Public Health did what I consider to be a model public health detective work when they when screening of refugee children in South King County found incredibly high levels of lead in their blood. And doing what public health investigators do, you go to the home, you look, can't figure it out. Surprise, it was in imported cookware, pots, pans, pressure cookers, especially those popular in the Afghan community of pressure cookers that were culturally used at home and being imported. But we've got incredibly strong testing work done by the county, and King 5 investigators have done some great reports on this, and leading to passage of a state law saying we need to test, and we've got a limit at 10 parts per billion in the material, the metal content. And that law was weakened this year before it took effect and delayed because of the cookware industry. If you want to be safe, use stainless steel. Remember, and we were talking about lead, there's also the PFAS issues about cookware. So you really need to look very carefully at cookware, and we need to do a more comprehensive review here in the state of Washington of all cookware for toxics. But I strongly suggest against buying low-cost imported aluminum cookware, even if it's clad in something. Because that aluminum is often produced by taking scrap metal and melting it down. And it turns out they're taking lead batteries and things and putting it in. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just echo what Rep. Pollet said. A lot of this cookware is recyclable. And so we're seeing a lot of imported cookware that has this high lead content just because it's really non-specific. All metal goes in the pot, it's melted, and that's what's formed. And there's even lead found in some rather expensive cookware that's been found. It's not just the cheap knockoff stuff that you might find. The further they study this problem, it's common in really expensive cookware. So I would echo the suggestion for stainless steel.
Excellent. Thank you both. I'm going to do another refresh on the Hoover side of things, see if any other questions are popping up. A personal comment, again, I just love my personal comments. Again, appreciate both of you for elevating lead poisoning concern as a Washington problem, because I think it's so common in the rhetoric to be like, oh, that's an East Coast thing. So that's an old buildings over there kind of thing. And just, yeah, to both of your points, we're seeing it and have seen it in so many different contexts. So I'm not seeing any additional questions in either Whova or Zoom. So folks, if you have any other questions, I'll draw this statement out for a minute here to give you a chance to ask that. But as folks are kind of gathering their final thoughts, I want to ask both of you, Representative Pollet, I'll start with you. Just, do you have any final thoughts or even points of action you'd like to convey to our viewers today?
Returning to the points of action, the recommendation for lead screening is really important, and the Department of Health, Healthcare Authority, and OFM did a joint response that said, yeah, we should amend the managed care organization MCO contracts to make sure that they have lead screening as an enforceable requirement, but we've got obstacles to doing this, and it's a very disappointing answer. But one of the obstacles, of course, is Medicaid funding. And the reimbursement rates, et cetera. So, and I want to remind people that the state legislature had ended up, because of our budget deficit, we cut funding for postnatal visits. So eliminating the 12-month visit and only doing 6 months of visits. These are the types of things that you need to actually do for community-oriented screening and action, coupled with actually funding reimbursements for the screening properly and making sure we're doing them. And it needs to be in the contracts for all providers. So that's one very important action. The second thing is I have been, people joke about that I've been tilting at this windmill for 12 years, but it's unacceptable to continue to have a ban on the Department of Health and Board of Health from adopting environmental public health rules to protect children in public schools. And that's something that your school districts are responsible for insisting that stay in there. The House of Representatives did pass in the budget removal of this a year ago, but the Senate wouldn't agree. We can do it again this year. People need to speak out to their legislators and say, it's unacceptable to not have school-specific environmental health rules, because that's where exposures are most likely to occur for a large part of the day.
Thank
I
you.
would,
Oh,
I would
please, Dr.
add,
Phillips.
yeah, I would add on top of this, we haven't talked about treatment of lead poisoning. So the treatment are, there's several medications that we have at our disposal, but for treatment of lead poisoning, many are in extremely limited supply, and we have a hard time getting it. Not only that, it's very expensive. These are really expensive drugs to get with a fair amount of side effects. And this really emphasizes, this is a preventable illness. We really should invest our dollars in prevention, not in treatment. And that's, I would really echo what Rep. Pollet is saying here. We really need to push it through and do a better job on schools and with healthcare providers doing more screening. There's many things that we can do to improve things in lead poisoning in the state.
Agreed. And I think that's such a good reminder to everyone that there's so much potential for change and growth and movement and progress at the local political level as well, at state levels and local jurisdictions. And just to what you were both saying, to all attendees here, use your voice, contact your representatives, and keep elevating this issue. All right. Well, we have just a couple minutes left, so just enough time for me to remind you of what else is coming up for the rest of the day here. So we're just about at our lunch break for today's series. We will all reconvene, let's see, at 1:15 p.m. for a talk on substance use disorders in older adults, which will also feature our very own Dr. Phillips right here. So we're getting a lot of work out of Dr. Phillips today. And then a reminder that at 2:30 p.m. we have a discussion on gas station highs with our own Dr. Jimmy Leonard. And then our final session of the day at 3:45 will be all on safer smoking supply distribution, specifically in Spokane. Without dragging it on any further, I want to go ahead and conclude today this particular session. And again, just personal, big thank you to both of you, Representative Pollet, Dr. Phillips, for sharing your insight and your expertise today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips and Alex, for moderating and adding such great comments for us.
And thank you for advocating for us. That's important.
Yep. All right. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you all soon. Bye now.